When a routine traffic stop turns into a life-altering, career-defining moment, a police officer's worst assumptions collide head-on with a truth he never saw coming. In that fleeting instance, a split-second decision can unravel years of training, unravel illusions of authority, and reshape the course of a man's future. Sometimes the target you choose holds a power that transcends the uniform you wear. Sometimes, in a single moment beneath the fading sun, the roles reverse in ways you could never anticipate. The sun was starting its gentle descent over the streets of Sacramento, draping the city in a warm glow and painting the sky in streaks of gold, amber, and faint lavender. It was that magical hour where the day's hustle was winding down, and the city's buzz softened just enough for people to breathe. In the midst of this transition, office buildings spilled tired workers into the streets. Some headed to the nearest bar for a quick drink, others rushed home to waiting families, and a few lingered at cafes to enjoy the early evening air. Eric Porter was among those making their way home. He'd spent the day in a high-rise downtown, leading meetings and crunching through a maze of administrative tasks that, while crucial, felt suffocatingly repetitive at times. Sitting in his dark blue sedan, a recent purchase he kept meticulously clean, he hummed along to low-volume music drifting from the radio. The gentle current of the air conditioning offered a soothing antidote to the lingering heat of the Sacramento summer. Even though the temperature outside had begun to cool, the residual warmth still clung to the asphalt. Eric, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and polished black shoes, eased his shoulders back against the seat, trying to shake off the day's accumulated stress. He approached a yellow traffic light, opting to slow down rather than gun the engine and risk pushing the boundary of the law. As it turned red, he eased to a smooth stop. That was the moment everything shifted. Blue and red lights exploded in his rearview mirror, accompanied by the ear-splitting wail of a police siren. Tension coiled in his chest, and he felt his stomach drop ever so slightly. It was remarkable how those flashing lights, even when you'd done nothing wrong, could cause a spike of adrenaline. Eric glanced in his rearview mirror, his brows furrowing. Although he hadn't registered any obvious infraction, he knew how these encounters could go. A slight miscommunication, a misunderstanding. It could all snowball. Still, he pulled over to the shoulder of the street, put his sedan in park, and rolled down his window. Sacramento's early evening hum continued around them, with the last rays of sunlight bouncing off glass windows and half-empty parking lots. From the parked police cruiser behind him stepped Officer Bradley Larson, a man in his mid-30s with a buzz cut that looked freshly trimmed and a badge gleaming on his broad chest. Larson wore the confident swagger of someone used to having his authority respected without question. With every step, his gear-laden belt jostled, handcuffs, a radio, a flashlight, and, of course, his sidearm. He stopped near the driver's side window and rapped once on the frame with a commanding knuckle. "License and registration," Larson said curtly. His voice carried just enough of an edge to let people know he didn't appreciate pushback. While he hadn't yet decided how the next few minutes would unfold, he radiated that sense of control many officers possess when they believe they have the upper hand. Eric complied without protest, reaching into his glove compartment to retrieve his registration. He felt the weight of Larson's gaze, as though the officer expected to catch sight of something suspicious, anything that would merit a further probe. Despite the subtle tension, Eric's movements were meticulous and unhurried. His daily interactions in a professional setting had taught him a great deal about maintaining composure under scrutiny. If there was one thing Eric had learned, it was to keep the calm upper hand, especially when things turned unpredictable. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Larson asked, leaning close enough that Eric could smell the remnants of stale coffee on the officer's breath. Eric kept his voice evenly modulated. "I'm not entirely sure, officer. I slowed at the light and thought I stopped before it turned red." Larson's eyes narrowed, and he drummed his fingers on the edge of the car door. "You didn't come to a full stop," he countered, though there was a momentary flicker in his voice that hinted he might be improvising. "Also, you seemed to hesitate, like you couldn't decide whether to run it." Eric considered explaining how he had, in fact, been fully aware of the yellow to red transition and chose to stop. But he merely nodded slightly. "I see. I believed I was in compliance, but I understand." Larson didn't immediately respond. His eyes lingered on Eric's tailored suit, on the neat cut of his hair, on the well-polished shoes. Something about Eric's calm composure seemed to feed the officer's urge to dig deeper. This didn't feel like a typical stop to Larson anymore. It felt like there was more to glean if he pressed the right buttons. He flipped through Eric's license and registration. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, the question carrying an unspoken suspicion. "I moved to Sacramento a few months ago," Eric replied, trying to keep his tone light. "All the updated info is on my license." Larson nodded, though with a nod of partial dismissal, not truly an acknowledgement. The officer's posture shifted. He seemed to square his shoulders in a way that put more weight behind his presence. Sacramento had its fair share of transplants from other cities, and not all of them were as squeaky clean as they looked. Something about Eric's collected calmness got under Larson's skin. It felt like Eric was too familiar with how these encounters could go, and for Larson, that rang alarm bells. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Larson pressed. Eric inhaled slowly. "Just going home," he replied, his voice still calm. "It's been a long day." The officer studied Eric carefully. The tension in the air was palpable now, and though Eric didn't outwardly show fear, Larson interpreted his composure as potential defiance, possibly the sign of someone used to manipulating the system. Whatever the origin of that prejudice, it was creeping up on him, fueling his suspicion. In truth, Larson's life had not been easy lately. Department budget cuts, arguments with his partner at home, and a recent scuffle with a higher-up over his conduct had left him on edge. He wasn't just on a routine patrol, he was patrolling his own future, determined to keep his position secure by showing he could maintain order. That was precisely why Eric's measured politeness agitated him. Here was a man who didn't display the usual nervousness, didn't stammer, didn't look away, and that, in Larson's mind, signaled potential trouble. Larson's gaze hovered on Eric once more. Then he took a step back, folding Eric's documents with excruciating slowness. Tucking them into his chest pocket, he let out a short breath that seemed to say, "I'm in control here." "Step out of the car for me," he ordered, his voice taut. Eric's hand reflexively tightened on the steering wheel, the tension evident in the subtle whiteness of his knuckles. Yet his expression stayed neutral. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" Larson's lips twitched, suppressing a smirk or maybe a scowl. "I asked you to step out of the car," he repeated, voice low with warning. "You don't want to make this any harder than it has to be." Eric exhaled, reminding himself to remain calm. There was a static charge in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. Slowly, he pushed the door open and stepped out. At 6 feet tall, Eric had a height advantage over Larson, but he kept his posture relaxed, as non-threatening as possible. His charcoal suit and polished shoes spoke of professionalism, not violence. Yet in Larson's eyes, that detail might or might not hold weight. "Hands where I can see them," Larson said, gesturing toward the front of Eric's sedan. The officer glanced around, acutely aware of the occasional passing car. A few curious faces peered from behind their own steering wheels, but no one stopped to intervene. Sacramento was a city that knew when to mind its own business. Eric did as instructed, placing his palms on the hood. The warmth of the car's engine still radiated through the metal, reminding him how recently he'd been driving. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" he asked. Larson made a faint, dismissive snort. "Just routine. We've had some incidents in this area," he declared, though he gave no specifics. "You can never be too careful." "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans?" Eric asked softly, turning his head to meet Larson's gaze. "Or does this have more to do with something else?" The question landed with weight, challenging the undercurrent of suspicion that had been swirling between them from the moment Larson approached. For an instant, Larson's composure faltered. His hand hovered near his belt, reacting instinctively, not because Eric was moving aggressively, but because the directness of the question felt like a challenge. "Watch your tone," he growled, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "I'm simply asking a question, officer," Eric replied, not raising his voice in the slightest. There was no defiance in his words, just a deliberate and confident clarity that put Larson even more on edge. The officer leaned in closer, eyes narrowing. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works. You got something to hide?" Eric allowed a pause to linger, long enough to register as deliberate. "No, officer," he finally said. I just believe in being clear about why we're doing this. Transparency, you know. Larson scoffed. The sound was ripe with skepticism and lingering frustration. He paced a small circle near the front of Eric's car, glancing at the sedan as though waiting for something suspicious to reveal itself. Most people in Eric's position will be fumbling with excuses by now. But not Eric. He stood there, calm, still, measured. It was that unwavering composure that felt so foreign to Larson. "You seem pretty confident," Larson muttered, almost to himself. "Like you think you know how this is all going to play out." Eric tilted his head, regarding the officer with mild curiosity. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." His voice was hushed, but it carried a conviction that could slice through the tension like a blade. Larson froze. For half a second, he forgot to mask his expression. The subtle swagger he'd shown moments earlier flickered. He'd seen an array of reactions over the years: panic, anger, tears, apologies. Rarely had he seen such calm, collected composure. As a police officer, part of him recognized that any calm person might be a real threat. Another part felt rattled. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged in such a balanced, matter-of-fact manner. The silence loomed, thick with possibility. Larson felt an internal push to maintain authority, to double down rather than back off. He tapped his fingers on his holster, a reflex that betrayed frustration he couldn't quite conceal. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," he said, voice clipped. "I need to check for weapons." Eric raised an eyebrow, the incredulity in his voice tempered with caution. "Weapons," he echoed. "Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon?" Larson's jaw clenched, and the tension in his muscles seemed to coil tighter. "I'm not going to ask you again," he said, feeling the seconds stretch like a rubber band about to snap. Eric decided to comply. He turned slowly, resting his palms on the hood once again. He reminded himself to keep breathing, to keep control over the hammering of his heart. He sensed the passers-by behind him, the occasional hush as a car drove by. This was not just a routine search. It felt more like an attempt to break him, to get him to show fear or disrespect that would justify further escalation. The pat-down was rough. Larson's hands lingered over Eric's waist, patted down his legs and torso with a bit more force than necessary. Eric's shoulders remained loose, refusing to let tension creep in. He understood that reacting could be exactly what Larson was angling for. Still, the process was invasive, an exercise in dominance that left Eric's nerves prickling. "You're clean," Larson muttered, stepping back. The admission seemed almost irritating to him, like he'd been hoping to find something, anything, to legitimize his suspicion. Eric turned, straightening his jacket with a quick, precise motion. His expression was calm, his eyes unwavering. "Of course I am," he said, voice steady. "Now, officer, if you're done." "I'm not done," Larson interjected, his voice suddenly louder. The words tumbled out too fast, betraying the desperation he felt to stay in control. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why?" Eric folded his arms, adopting a relaxed stance that contrasted sharply with Larson's tension. "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," he said. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Larson squinted, as though trying to force the puzzle pieces together. "That's so? You a lawyer or something?" A faint smile tugged at Eric's lips. "Or something." The ambiguity was deliberate, and judging by the flush creeping up Larson's neck, it landed precisely as Eric intended. Stepping closer, Larson leaned in, reducing the space between them to mere inches. "Listen, you think you're smarter than me. Think you can talk your way out of this?" Eric's gaze didn't waver. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And so far, I'm not seeing a lot of that here." The challenge hung in the evening air. In the distance, a dog barked. Someone turned up the volume on a passing car radio, a brief burst of bass throbbing through the tension. Larson clenched his teeth so tightly Eric almost heard them grind. "Fairness? You think fairness is what this is about?" he said, his voice almost trembling with indignation. "People like you always," he stopped mid-sentence, as though he realized he was stepping onto dangerously thin ice. Eric didn't flinch. He took a slight step back, letting the night air swirl between them. "People like me," he repeated, voice low but weighted with significance. Larson's cheeks darkened, and for a moment he looked genuinely uncertain. "You know what I mean," he mumbled, but his earlier self-assuredness was absent. He was stepping around the words he almost let slip, words that might have made his intentions glaringly obvious. Eric's composure tightened like a drawn bow. A subtle shift in his posture revealed he'd caught exactly what Larson implied, and it cut deep. "I think I do," Eric said quietly, each syllable loaded with the understanding that this situation was no longer about a mere traffic violation. "And I think we both know this interaction stopped being about the traffic light a while ago." Larson opened his mouth, but no immediate response came. For once, the officer looked truly at a loss, as though he'd stumbled over a step in his carefully choreographed dance. The power dynamic, once so firmly tilted in his favor, was sliding precariously in the other direction. Eric's voice sliced through the silence, steady and unyielding. "Officer, I think it's time you know who I am." Larson's brows knit together in renewed irritation. He latched onto an instinctive response. "I don't care who you are," he snarled, though there was a slight crack in his tone that betrayed his unease. Eric raised his hand slowly, reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket. "I'm reaching for my badge," he announced, calm and clear. Larson's hand twitched near his holster, eyes flaring with sudden alertness. "No need for theatrics," Eric continued. "I want you to see it." The tension thickened as Eric produced a small leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a glimmering metal badge. It caught the last rays of sunlight, reflecting them into Larson's eyes. "Eric Porter," he said, his tone almost neighborly, as though they were exchanging pleasantries at a cocktail party. "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." Larson went still. His breath caught for a fraction of a second, disbelief warring with dread in his eyes. He took a small step back, his shoulders scraping against the side mirror of Eric's sedan. Internal Affairs," he repeated, voice faintly trembling. "You're—" "Yes," Eric interjected, saving Larson from completing that sentence. "I oversee officer conduct. My role is to ensure that men and women who wear this badge do so with integrity and honor." Larson's face paled, beads of sweat forming at his temple. He looked down at his own uniform, as if he were suddenly aware of the symbolic weight of the badge pinned to his chest. The confidence he wore like armor seemed to disintegrate, leaving behind a vulnerable shell of a man who realized, far too late, that he just crossed a line he might not be able to uncross. Eric took a measured step forward, closing the gap Larson had instinctively created. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction is?" he asked, his voice calm but piercing. Larson's gaze darted away, then back again, searching for an exit that didn't exist. "It's not the profiling," Eric continued quietly, though his words carried sharp condemnation. "That's bad enough on its own, let's be clear. And it's not the baseless escalation, though that's an enormous problem." He paused, letting the words settle. "It's that you've done. All of this without even realizing you were talking to someone who deeply understands his rights and your responsibilities." Larson's lips parted, but silence was all that emerged. A swirl of regret, panic, and anger crossed his features. He was caught. He was compromised. And the man he'd been cornering now held the power to impact his entire career. Eric's voice remained unwavering. "You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold. And why?" He let the question sink in. "Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect?" At this, Larson's shoulders sagged. The adrenaline from the encounter drained in a rush, leaving him standing there stunned. He looked at the badge in Eric's hand as though it might disappear if he just blinked enough times. But it remained, glinting in the early evening light. Eric stepped back, giving the officer a moment to breathe, but not letting him off the hook. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice shifting to a tone of professional finality. "You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next." Larson hesitated. He wasn't sure whether to keep pressing, to apologize, or to simply run. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but no coherent retort emerged. Eric just lifted a brow, waiting. The unspoken threat of consequences hung in the air like a heavy weight. Finally, Larson reached into his chest pocket, retrieving Eric's license and registration. His hands shook as he handed them over, beads of sweat sliding down his brow. "Here," he said hoarsely, unable to disguise the tremor in his voice. Eric took them without comment, slipping them back into his wallet. He moved to the driver's side door of his sedan, pausing with one hand on the handle. Turning slightly, he locked eyes with Larson one last time. "Remember this, Officer Larson," Eric said, each word carrying the weight of a lesson that would echo long after. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." With that, Eric slid back into his car, started the engine, and pulled away, leaving Larson standing under the fading sun, the swirling dust of the road gathering around his ankles like a reminder of how fragile authority could be. The officer's cheeks burned with shame, and the question now pounding in his head was how long it would be until he heard from Internal Affairs. He suspected it wouldn't be very long at all. Meanwhile, the drive home for Eric was surprisingly quiet. The adrenaline from the confrontation slowly ebbed, leaving him with a tumult of reflections. That incident had not been unique. He'd experienced different shades of the same prejudice before. But this one was different because he now held the authority to act on the wrongdoing. He intended to use it not merely as personal retribution, but as a step toward a broader cultural shift in the department he served. The next morning, the sun filtered through half-drawn blinds in Eric's office at Sacramento's Internal Affairs Division. The line between day and night in that part of the building was perpetually blurry. The overhead fluorescent lights stayed on most of the time, illuminating the piles of files that lived on nearly every desk. But Eric was used to it. He thrived in an environment where clarity was king, where you either had integrity or you did not, where you told the truth or you lied. Gray areas were harder, but he wasn't someone who shied away from complexity. A file folder with Officer Bradley Larson's name lay open on his desk. It wasn't thick, but it wasn't entirely thin either. Minor complaints sprinkled through his record, small flags of unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, occasional allegations of rude behavior. Incidents that had never been fully pursued, likely brushed aside as misunderstandings or one-off slip-ups. Eric knew better than most how these cumulative behaviors could point to a deeper pattern. He'd seen it happen before, and he knew the damage it could do to citizens, to communities, and ultimately to the trust people need to have in their police force. He steepled his fingers, exhaling softly as he stared at the file. Larson wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of something more pervasive, an underlying culture that allowed certain mindsets to flourish unchecked. If Eric was going to make a real difference, he couldn't just treat the symptom. He had to find a way to cure the disease. A knock on the office door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant, Linda, poked her head in. She was carrying a stack of freshly printed reports, and her face bore that slight morning weariness that coffee alone couldn't fix. "Morning, Mr. Porter," she greeted, stepping into the room. "Here are the summaries of last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels asked me to remind you about the department review next week." She paused, sensing the tension in the air. "Everything okay?" "Thanks, Linda," Eric replied, taking the files from her. He added a soft, reassuring smile. "Could you schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." "Of course," Linda said, though her eyes lingered on him for a moment, concerned. Sensing the weight of his mood, she nodded politely and slipped out of the room. Eric returned his attention to Larson's file, flipping through each page with methodical precision. The more he read, the more he felt the scope of what needed to be done. He'd been aware for a while that quiet, behind-the-scenes patches would never address the root issues. Real change demanded a cultural shift, a willingness to do more than just reprimand the bad apples. It required taking a hard look at training protocols, accountability measures, community relationships, and especially the leadership at the top. Later that afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in a small conference room. Daniels was a seasoned officer, a man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and a pragmatic, no-nonsense demeanor. He had served Sacramento for decades, rising through the ranks and weathering more controversies than he cared to remember. Now, perched on the edge of his chair, arms folded, he listened intently as Eric recounted the traffic stop with Larson, step by step. I could have just let it go, Eric said, keeping his voice steady, treated it as one more bad encounter out there on the streets. But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of deeper problems that need addressing. Daniels rubbed his temples, exhaling through his nose. The lines on his face deepened, and there was something akin to weariness in his eyes. This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up, he admitted. We've handled it quietly in the past, informal warnings, the usual. But it looks like that approach isn't working. Quiet doesn't fix anything, Eric countered gently but firmly. Quiet just lets it continue under the radar. We need a more systematic approach. A bandage on a bullet wound won't heal it. It just hides the blood. Chief Daniels let out a long sigh. So, what do you propose? Eric straightened, speaking with conviction. A department-wide review. Not just of individual officers, but of our training, protocols, accountability systems, everything. If we don't hold ourselves to the highest standard, how can we expect the community to trust us? We can't keep sweeping issues like Larson's under the rug. Daniels leaned forward, intertwining his fingers on the table. You're going to ruffle a lot of feathers, Eric, he said, a hint of warning in his tone. This department has been under scrutiny before, and we've worked hard to maintain some level of public confidence. Feathers need to be ruffled, Eric replied, matter of fact, if it means real change. Otherwise, these issues will keep creeping up, and next time it could be worse. Next time, someone might get hurt, or the entire community might lose faith in the badge altogether. The chief nodded slowly. The weight of the conversation pressed heavily on him. All right, he finally said, let's do it. But be prepared for pushback from the union, from certain corners of City Hall. Not everyone wants to see the boat rocked, especially when budgets and reputations are on the line. Eric allowed himself a small, grateful smile. I'm ready, Chief. Sacramento deserves better. So does our department. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and report compilation. Eric dove into the tasks, working tirelessly with a team from internal affairs. They pored over old files, re-examined complaints previously dismissed as misunderstandings, and set up public forums where citizens could voice their concerns. Some officers bristled, feeling targeted or undervalued. Others quietly supported Eric's push, relieved that someone was finally willing to address the root causes of misconduct. Tension in the halls of the precinct was thick enough to taste. Eventually, Officer Bradley Larson faced an internal hearing. Eric made no secret of his role in the investigation. During the proceedings, Larson sat across from him, his usually confident demeanor visibly shaken. His hands twitched nervously in his lap, eyes darting anywhere but at Eric's face. Witnesses stepped forward, describing not just Eric's incident but other questionable stops. Patterns of behavior emerged, painting a concerning picture of profiling and escalated encounters. While some on the review board wanted to terminate Larson outright, a compromise was reached, a suspension coupled with mandatory retraining and psychological evaluations. It was a stern punishment, but Eric understood this was bigger than just penalizing Larson. It was about preventing the next Larson. Months later, Eric stood at a podium in a large community center, addressing an audience composed of officers, city officials, and Sacramento residents. Flyers for the event had invited citizens to come and discuss police reform initiatives. The tension in the air felt more hopeful than combative. People wanted to believe in change, yet years of disappointment tempered their enthusiasm. Eric could sense it as he looked out over the crowd, a mixture of skepticism and longing. He cleared his throat, microphone feedback momentarily squealing. Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys, he began, voice echoing through the hall. It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for every individual they encounter. A few heads nodded in the front rows, and Eric continued, letting his voice rise and fall with the sincerity of his convictions. That's the badge I believe in. The one that commands both respect and accountability. And that's what we're working toward together. This department-wide review isn't just about punishing those who step out of line. It's about building a culture that prevents those missteps in the first place. A round of applause reverberated through the large, open space, but Eric didn't pause to bask in it. He had more to say. He spoke of transparent policing, of forging real relationships with local communities, of encouraging officers to see themselves as guardians rather than enforcers. He emphasized the importance of building a system where a complaint wasn't just shoved in a file drawer, but addressed openly so trust could grow. When he stepped down from the podium, a throng of people approached. Some wore uniforms, some wore business suits, and others were casual clothes. He shook hands, listened to personal stories, took notes. He could see the seeds of transformation in their eyes, some full of determination, some still tinged with doubt, but all aware that something in Sacramento was shifting. Later, as Eric packed up his notes and headed home, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought about Larson, about that night on the side of the road when a routine traffic stop sparked a revelation. It wasn't the first time Eric had encountered a prejudiced officer, but it might be the first time he truly had the power to shape the aftermath on a broad scale. And that gave him a sense of purpose beyond just fulfilling his role at internal affairs. For once, he felt that the system could be nudged, maybe not easily, not quickly, but with persistence, toward real accountability. The road ahead was long, and the challenges were many. Entrenched mindsets and systemic issues would not dissolve with a single suspension, a single review, or a single speech. But Eric believed wholeheartedly in the value of each incremental step. No single day would fix the department, but every day he showed up, every complaint he investigated, every officer he guided toward better training, those were the building blocks of meaningful reform. For Eric, the events that began with a red traffic light and flashing patrol lights had transitioned into a grander mission, one that was not just about his own dignity, but about redefining how officers approached the people they served. He knew from that point on that each policy he helped shape, each case he scrutinized, each cultural shift he championed, would reverberate through the corridors of the Sacramento Police Department. Perhaps, over time, other departments would follow suit. Perhaps the entire city would come to see the badge not as a symbol of unassailable power, but as the responsibility-laden shield it was always meant to be. His story, and the story of Officer Bradley Larson, would echo as a cautionary tale about assumptions and authority. But it would also stand as a testament to what could happen when someone with insight, experience, and integrity used their authority to challenge the status quo. And while Eric knew not everyone would welcome this challenge, he also knew change never came from the comfort of silence. As for Larson, he served out his suspension under a cloud of scrutiny, unsure if he would ever regain the confidence of his peers or the trust of Sacramento's citizens. Perhaps he would eventually learn from the experience, learn that wearing a badge demanded a level of humility and responsibility that had long eluded him. Or perhaps he would leave the force altogether, seeking a fresh start somewhere else. Either way, his moment of reckoning had been served, and the department had taken a concrete step to examine how such behaviors could flourish undetected. Outside, in the Sacramento dusk, streetlights blinked to life. Cars streamed along busy avenues, and people walked their dogs along the leafy sidewalks. Life moved forward, as it always does, but something beneath the surface felt different. There was a stirring, a call for a new standard, one that Eric and those who believed in true service would continue to fight for. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's start the conversations that matter, the ones that spark change in our communities, our institutions, and ourselves. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we can achieve when we stand for what's right.